Thank you to everybody joining online and in person for the final session of this year's WHRI Summer Scholars Series event. We begin by acknowledging that the WHRI operates on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Further, this acknowledgement, gratitude, and respect extends to all the First Nations communities on whose traditional territories the WHRI builds relationships. This session will conclude our 2025 theme, Sex and Gender-Based Analysis Plus, across the health research pillars. We are honored to welcome Professor Patricia Barkaskas as our virtual speaker. Professor Barkaskas is a Métis lawyer and educator. She's an associate professor at the Allard School of Law at the University of British Columbia and currently holds the Law Foundation of Saskatchewan H. Robert Arscott Chair of the University of Saskatchewan College of Law. Patricia was previously the strategic advisor to the Dean for the National Centre for Indigenous Laws, an associate professor within the Faculty of Law at the University of Victoria, as well as academic director of Indigenous Legal Studies and academic director of the Indigenous Community Legal Clinic at Allard Law. Her current and future teaching and research interests include Indigenous laws, access to justice for Indigenous peoples, and decolonizing and indigenizing law. Patricia has practiced across a broad spectrum of law, including the areas of child protection as a parent's counsel, criminal, family, as well as civil litigation and prison law. She spent over a decade working closely with Indigenous peoples in their encounters with the Canadian legal system and has worked for residential school survivors as a historical legal researcher for the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. In addition, in person, we have Shireen Banai, who's a Senior Project Management Advisor for the MICU Secretariat. Thank you for being here. So before we begin, a few technical notes. To support discussion, we'll be facilitating breakout rooms for the in-person and virtual attendees following the presentation. Nicole Presley will lead this portion and provide further instructions once the presentation concludes. And then in late August, we'll be circulating an evaluation form on the 2025 Summer Scholars Series and would appreciate your feedback for future events. Please join me in welcoming Patricia Barkaskas.
Tanashi, my name is Patricia Barkaskas. It is a pleasure to be with you all here today. I apologize that this is a virtual session as opposed to an in-person session, which I had hoped it would be. But a sudden move has meant that I have to change my plans and join you this way today. But I'm so happy to be here with everyone and to be sharing with you the incredible work of the Indigenous, the IGBA Toolkit from MICU. I am joining you today from the incredibly beautiful Wasanich territories here on Vancouver Island, and I acknowledge the host nations in the location that the virtual event is taking place, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. So I will now make this screen here small so we can just see this and begin. The format of the workshop today is going to be a presentation that is going to last about 25 minutes to a half an hour. And then we'll be moving into some breakout groups for some discussion, after which we will come back together and then we will share our discussion points, having a report back, and a little bit of further discussion and Q&A. So let me just get my screen sorted here. Thank you. The Ministry's Advisory Council on Indigenous Women is a group of women dedicated to the work of providing advice to government on the way that government policy and practice implements and affects the lives of Indigenous women, gender diverse, and two-spirit people. MICU was established in 2011, and the mandate is to provide advice on how to improve the quality of life for Indigenous women in BC. We are made up of 10 members with one position designated for an elder and for a youth. And the Minister of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation has appointed members based on criteria of experience, diversity, and regional representation. So before I turn to the actual IGBA Plus toolkit, a little bit about the history of where this came from and how McHugh turned our attention to the need for the creation of an IGBA toolkit. So we were inspired to develop the IGBA Plus toolkit after Amnesty International's report came out in 2016, followed by the Firelight report in 2017. The Firelight report was initiated by community leaders in the Lake Babine First Nation with the Nakazalit First Nation, which I have not said appropriately. Unfortunately, I tried very hard with my pronunciation, but I also struggle with my own languages and apologize for not pronouncing that appropriately. There was a recommendation that resonated with the members of McHugh for government and industry to apply IGBA Plus to the regulatory processes prior to resource extraction and development projects being built in Indigenous communities and territories. McHugh felt that that we are uniquely positioned in our advisory advocacy role to contribute to seeing this recommendation come to life. So we found that the Firelight Group and Amnesty International's reports really articulated the ways that Indigenous women and girls are subjected to the worst of the negative impacts of resource extraction, including increased violence, sexual harassment and assault, substance abuse often resulting from the increased violence experienced, and then increased incidence of sexually transmitted infections due to rape, prostitution, and sex trafficking. Due to the increased demand for sex work, there's often a correlation between the ways that sex work impacts on women's lives and increases a number of these other factors. So in Fort St. James, for example, the Firelight report reported that there was a 38% increase in sexual assaults during the first year of the construction phase of an industrial project. And that's just, of course, one example of these types of incidents. So the model of the temporary industrial camp that takes place when industry comes into communities to engage in these projects requires a mobile workforce that is disconnected from the region. This mobile workforce is largely made up of men and reinforces and recreates historical patterns of violence against Indigenous women, according to the Firelight report. So this connects to colonization in the sense that women in Euro-Christian value systems were established as accessories to men. They were literally, legally chattel, dependent upon fathers, brothers, husbands, and other male relations in terms of ensuring that their livelihoods and lives and access to resources were available to them. They were perceived as not capable of leading households and not capable of participating in education systems, political institutions, workplaces, and activities outside of the domestic Christian-oriented household. So when colonization in Canada took place, there was a transference of these Euro-Christian values into our Canadian legal system. So the centering of personhood and citizenship was on a white, heterosexual, cis male who held property. That changed for white, heterosexual, cis women over time, but not until very, very long into colonization. And certainly it didn't have an impact on Indigenous women in the same way when that happened. So over time, we saw that there are there are ways that the history of how colonization happens has a more detrimental effect on Indigenous women than potentially on Indigenous men. And part of that is through law in terms of Indian status, but there are other ways as well. So prior to contact, Indigenous women were active in their communities. They were perceived differently within their communities, but also across communities in terms of having power and holding authority. They held a variety of leadership roles in their communities, and often negotiations between Indigenous nations about Indigenous legal issues were led by the women in the communities. So many Indigenous communities were matrilineal, and that meant that leadership roles and responsibilities were passed down through the female lines and lineages. When we think about the way that colonization in Canada is woven into law, right into our Constitution, in fact, we can see that the resulting legal statutes, such as the Indian Act, both subtly and overtly impact how Indigenous women have been treated over time. So when we think about the codification of these issues in Canadian law, particularly in the Indian Act, many of the provisions within the Indian Act are targeted at displacing Indigenous women from our inherent and rightful roles as matriarchs. And while right now, we know that the Indian Act specifically applies to First Nations in Canada differently than it does Métis and Inuit. It's also important to point out that at various points in the Indian Act's history, specifically Métis people were removed from the Indian Act. So amendments to the Indian Act, the last one being in 1951, for example, removed Métis people from the Indian Act, but they were also impacted by the provisions of the Indian Act prior to that. So the Indian Act made it illegal for Indigenous women to run for positions of chief or council in their nations. It was illegal for them to vote in elections until 1951. Indigenous women were the last ethnic group in Canada to have the right to vote in federal, provincial, and municipal elections, and that right was granted to them in 1960. Indigenous women who married non-Indigenous men lost their Indian status, which meant they could not live in their communities or received Indian band programs or services. And it also meant that their children, of course, did not retain status and then could not return to their communities either. So an amendment in 1985, of course, overturned that provision. However, there are many Indigenous women who are still not included. It's estimated that approximately 2 million Indigenous women have been displaced across Canada since the Indian Act was created. So approximately 150,000 children were also forced to attend the Indian residential schools, which were open and active for over 100 years. The attendance in the schools was forced and enforced by the Canadian government and the RCMP, who would go into communities and literally steal children. Parents could face criminal charges and jail time if they didn't send their children and they tried to hide them and not allow them to be taken to residential schools. And then, of course, residential schools were not the only educational system in place to ensure that children were educated outside of their own governance and legal models. Day schools also existed, and these became more prevalent as the residential schools started to close. So the increase of apprehension of Indigenous children by child welfare then took over in many ways from the residential school system. And there was a direct line from the removal of children to residential schools into the removal of children in the child welfare systems across the provinces and territories. So at the beginning of the 1960s, less than 1% of children in care in child welfare system were Indigenous, but by the end of the decade, 30 to 40% of children in care were Indigenous. And we know now, of course, that those numbers are horrifically high. So why Indigenous gender-based analysis plus? We have seen an incredible engagement with gender-based analysis plus across government and various government-related policy and practice-based industry. But why Indigenous gender-based analysis plus as opposed to just gender-based analysis? And the difference between these is really focused in on this idea that that colonization has, through several specific approaches and processes, including the forced implementation of colonial forms of governance and family making, contributed to the historic and ongoing marginalization of Indigenous women, girls, and gender diverse individuals. So importantly, Indigenous gender-based analysis plus starts from the place of recognizing colonization as an ongoing systemic force and dealing with that as the starting point. So to implement gender-based analysis means to analyze the socio-cultural and historical realities resulting from colonization and systemic racism and sexism as a starting point. So McHugh's IGBA Plus Toolkit came into being primarily in many ways through the work of Sarah Robinson. So we consider the toolkit to be a large part of Sarah Robinson's legacy. Sarah is unfortunately no longer with us. She has passed, but she was a member of McHugh for many, many years. I think, and Shireen might be able to correct me on this, but I believe it was 7. And Sarah personally believed that Canada can look better in the span of a generation if all Canadians understand its true history. So Sarah dedicated her life to working towards this vision of a better Canada that was inclusive and respectful to all Indigenous peoples. She was a tireless advocate, an activist, a knowledge keeper, educator, and visionary. The IGBA Plus Toolkit was an initiative that Sarah wanted to see come to life and become implemented by federal, provincial, municipal governments, corporations, Indigenous communities, and Indigenous women and Indigenous women's groups across the nation. She invested over 6 years of her life in advocacy to ensure that the provincial government supported the development of the IGBA Plus Toolkit. The toolkit was co-authored by Dr. Natalie Clark and Chastity Davis-Alphonse in partnership with McHugh. So the IGBA Plus Toolkit is to McHugh an invitation to every government worker, every corporate employee, and every Indigenous leader to learn the history and the current reality of Indigenous women and gender diverse people in this country. It's a call to action to intentionally include Indigenous women's voices, knowledge, and lived experience into decision making. So IGBA Plus is about centering, valuing, and restoring the Indigenous women's lens into decision-making, projects, governance, and policies and practices across the spectrum. This inclusion will increase the safety, wellness, and overall quality of life for Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit and gender diverse people. The 7 guiding principles of McHugh's IGBA Plus Toolkit, which we can see here, are meaningful inclusion, centering Indigenous women, the 7 R's, being healing centered, policy analysis through the lens of Indigenous women, Indigenous gendered approaches, and being holistic and intersectional. So, meaningful inclusion is about the diversity of Indigenous women, Two-Spirit, and gender diverse individuals, and about acknowledging the work of grassroots and community in the work of moving forward a decolonial and indigenized perspective throughout the work that government, industry, and corporations use across Canada. In centering Indigenous women, we literally talk about the inclusion of Indigenous women and allowing Indigenous women to speak directly in their own words to their needs and also to what does not work for them. So, in many cases, when we see consultations with Indigenous communities or leadership, the voice of Indigenous women is missing from that as well. Even more so, perhaps, the voices of Indigenous, gender diverse, and Two-Spirit communities. But we can see that the policies and practices that are implemented when Indigenous women's voices aren't included in consultation don't work for Indigenous women. And that's a ubiquitous and repeating pattern. The 7 R's are principles about thinking through how colonization has impacted Indigenous women and the voice of Indigenous women in their own communities and in leadership and governance that works to consult with governments, corporations, industry, and really is about thinking about Indigenous-led self-determination and self-governance that includes Indigenous women, gender diverse, and Two-Spirit people in a meaningful way. So, in remembering Indigenous women's power and knowledge, the truth of harms created by colonialism can be revealed. When we think about rematriation, we're talking about centering matriarchal knowledge, leadership, and connections to the land through women's lived experiences and the history of Indigenous women's leadership roles within their own communities and nations. Reclaiming is about thinking through ceremony, protocol, and practices and moving to a place where those are surfaced and can be reintegrated into the work that we're doing. When we talk about respect, we're talking about respecting laws, ceremonies, and knowledge. So there's a whole bunch of work being done in terms of revitalization of Indigenous laws across many different nations and communities in Canada. And when we think about respecting, we want to really think about where, again, due to colonization and racism and sexism, laws have been reimagined over time within communities to exclude Indigenous women. So, in respecting our laws as Indigenous peoples in our different communities and nations, we must go back and revitalize where Indigenous women have been removed from those legal processes and protocols. So, recognizing resistance. I'm sorry, I missed relationships. So, forming respectful relationships is about thinking through and returning to the actual relationships that Indigenous women had, not just with each other and not just with their laws and their governance systems, but as between nations. When we talked earlier about the idea that women were often in a leadership role for negotiating between nations, Indigenous nations, and also in colonialism, Indigenous women held a very powerful role in many communities in terms of negotiating with colonial powers as it encroached on their communities. And there have been many examples since colonialism of Indigenous women taking up that power again and returning to those relationships of leadership. Recognizing resistance is also about honoring and acknowledging historically that resistance and the ongoing resistance to the marginalization of Indigenous women as it's taking place in the present. So, acts of resistance are everywhere, and we have seen over and over again Indigenous women take up very important social, sociocultural, legal, and advocacy roles in their community in order to move issues forward. So we need to really think about recognizing that resistance and bringing it to the forefront in our conversations. And last of the 7 R's is relinquishing power. And that really is about making space for the 6 R's above it to truly come into the conversation. And again, to move over in order to really allow for Indigenous led self determination and self governance, where women are a meaningful part of the conversation and are really being centered in the act of making new making new relationships. Moving to healing centered approaches. This principle is about a holistic approach involving culture, spirituality, and collective healing. It is consent based and it honors confidentiality as a central premise. So when we engage in conversations with Indigenous women across communities as researchers, let's say, when government consults, it's really important that Indigenous women, gender diverse, and two-spirit people really be allowed in a consent-based way to bring forward their concerns without having to be afraid of repercussions within their community or within the relationships that they've developed with the non-Indigenous partners. When we think about policy analysis through the lens of Indigenous women, this is about policy solutions that acknowledge that Indigenous women, girls, and gender diverse people are the best guides of determining their own needs. And so we do not try to speak for people that we are not representative of. It's a part of putting into action the principle nothing about us without us, but it goes beyond that when we think about truly policy analysis that allows for a step away from the colonial violence of the usual practice in that space. So Indigenous gendered approaches is a principle that really focuses on the importance of centering Indigenous methodologies such as land-based and ceremonial practices, and also, of course, Indigenous laws. So thinking about the ways to weave in Indigenous laws as they're being revitalized and recognizing the roles of women in governance and in legal positions in their communities. It's also about thinking about language and the ways that language really impacts on how law, policy, and practice are conceived. Some of this work is being done, for example, when we think about revitalization of Indigenous laws in the child welfare context. There are communities who are writing their own child welfare laws at this point in time, who are really grappling with how they use colonial, moving away from using colonial words for what child welfare even means to them, because when they return to their own laws and language, they see that what it means to care for children is such a different thing, and that comes through first in the words used. So the idea that there isn't such a word or set of words or a concept that is, quote, child welfare, because taking care of children was so much more than that. Um, so, really important to think about the ways that language can lead in some of these. In some of these ways that we think about Indigenous gendered approaches. And then as we move to the idea of everything being holistic and intersectional, we're talking about recognizing the diversity that exists within and across Indigenous cultures. So we really have to think about the ways that we are, as Indigenous peoples, um, interrelated, and we have many kinship ties, and we are often we have very similar thoughts and ideas about the way that the world operates, or our laws and protocols can be very similar, and we can also be very different. And that's really very, very important to acknowledge and to think about the diversity of Indigenous women, two-spirit and gender diverse individuals in terms of ages, roles, Indigenous status, Indigenous nationhood, and where you come from, your grassroots experience and your leadership experiences. So the toolkit really was created for meaningful application by governments, corporations, Indigenous communities, and individuals. For each of these principles I've just talked about, there are questions that can assist you in applying an Indigenous women's lens to your own work. There's also an annotated bibliography for further reading. Um, there's, of course, the place you can find the IGBA Plus Toolkit and the annotated bibliography. So that information can and will be shared with you. And we're going to think about some discussions and reflections as we move into our breakout groups in just a moment here. So I really want you to think about how can you weave Indigenous women's voices, knowledge, and lived experience into your work and your workplace? How can you apply the 7 IGBA plus guiding principles? And more than just theoretically, what are some practical examples of how you can do this? When we return for discussion and report back, we're going to think about these two questions that you've discussed. And Shireen and I can also give some practical examples from our own experiences working with the IGBA Plus toolkit with government, and also in some of the other work that we do. And just want to close out with this quote from Sarah Robinson, which is incredibly meaningful. Prior to contact, the impression that I have from families and communities is that our women were loved, held up, respected, and honored as life givers, and honored beyond life giving, honored for who we were and who we are outside of our ability to give life to the future generations, which is an important part and aspect of womanhood, but isn't the only thing. So very quickly, before we move into our discussion groups, I'm just going to quickly pull up for you here the, let me find it. So hopefully you can all see the actual page that I'm on now, which is the Indigenous Gender-Based Plus toolkit page from McHugh. And you can see here that you can, of course, find the toolkit, but there are also various flyers that are specific to different groups. So I'm going to pull up this flyer here, which is the Indigenous Gender-Based Analysis Plus for Government flyer. And just because I think it's very appropriate for the work that folks are doing now in the context of this particular group of people that we're gathering today. So here are the principles, as you can see, and in the principles, under each of the principles, you can see specific questions that might be very valuable in terms of thinking about your work as you're moving forward. So I'm not going to go over these all right now, but I just really wanted to pull them up so that you had a sense of what you might get out of the toolkit in practice, right? So if we even just look at Principle 1, meaningful inclusion of the diversity of Indigenous women, you can see questions that might offer you some guidance in the work that you're doing. Have you invested in building trust and relationship with the community? And within the community, does that engagement go beyond elected leadership? Are there community groups that can be included and engaged? Youth groups, elders, council, women's council, cultural groups, 2S LGBTQIA plus groups, etc. So you can see here that there are very practical questions that can be guiding principles in terms of how you think through the 7 R's in the work that you do, and also the other guiding principles from the kit. So just wanted to pull that up to give you a look at it and think about it. You might want to pull it up now in terms of thinking about the questions that I've asked, those 2 questions, as we move into our breakout groups. So
thanks so much, Patricia. I am up. I am going to, I have opened up breakout rooms. Please join your breakout room, and I'll just wait here just to make sure that everyone has a breakout room. And for the folks in person, it sounds like there's a small enough group that you folks are going to gather together to form your own breakout room. And Rebecca, I believe you are joining room 4 online. Thank you for pivoting. 60 seconds to rejoin.
Don't you find that one of the like project timelines are short? It doesn't know it's the real time. Yes. Yes.
Patricia, we almost have everyone. Room 3 looks chatty. They're just waiting to come back.
That's good.
That's a good sign. I think they were forced to join us.
great. Thanks. Yeah. So if folks nominated a person to report back, it'd be great if you could share your reflections. I think we'll have to do it popcorn style. I don't know any other way to do it. You'll just have to jump in or raise your hand, I guess. All right, I'm voluntolding Julian to go first.
Oh, good.
Okay, so Some of the points I took down were in meetings to open the meeting in a good way and then allow people time to introduce themselves, their ancestry, their location, acknowledge Indigenous days of significance, and generally provide a safe space for Indigenous peoples to be themselves, but also beyond just Indigenous peoples, understanding by people introducing themselves, that helping to build relationships and build trust. As settlers, decentering our experience and paying attention to other people's experience, and thinking about whatever issue we're thinking about or problem we're thinking about it in the context of colonialism and its ongoing effects. And in terms of consulting with communities, there's a suggestion to move beyond elected officials, which for various reasons may or may not really be representative of a community. And the final point I have is to, again, as settlers, to understand the distrust that exists of healthcare systems, and I'll add of education systems as well, particularly given that this is a very founded distrust. So in the case of healthcare systems, there's been a lot of history of abuse by healthcare systems related to, for instance, fertility and gynecology. So yeah, those are the things that I took down.
Thank you. Who wants to go next?
I can summarize next for my group. Hi, everyone. So one of the discussion points was around the importance of the healing-centered approach, and just recognizing that some discussions in different settings, so we talked about government and research, may be triggering for people who are Indigenous and belong to the community that are kind of being discussed at that time. And so making sure that everybody is aware of that and directing to relevant programs and services in the community where appropriate. And then the other part of the discussion we had was around the research environment, which is under my scope, and just thinking about involving Indigenous women, gender diverse people, and two-spirit individuals as early as possible in the research process, even really right from the beginning, in terms of them being involved in advising researchers on the research priorities of their community and making sure that the research addresses their needs. And that goes beyond having them involved as participants in the research, but also as centering their voices and ensuring that they are involved in decision making and key leaders on that team, basically. And then that continues throughout each stage. And so early consultation with communities who are going to be impacted by the research is essential. Oh, and one last thing, one of our main reflections was just on the importance of what Patricia said about nothing about us without us, and making sure that Indigenous women, girls, gender diverse people, and two-spirit individuals are they're respected as the people who are best placed to inform the decisions that are going to impact their lives and benefit them. Thanks.
Thank you. Who wants to go next?
Hi there, I can share from the room here. Sorry, I had to find a mic that actually worked. We had some amazing experts with us here in the room, so felt really privileged to have this conversation with folks here. I think amazing points that have already been brought up. One thing I'd add that we were discussing is really the importance of relationship building in this work and building trust and the acknowledgement that to do that properly, it takes a lot of time and effort, which doesn't generally align very well with kind of research timelines, research deliverables, but the importance of doing that. We also discussed, kind of tried to get into the nuts and bolts about the best way to kind of approach communities to become involved in this work and being persistent perhaps, or, going back with the acknowledgement that sometimes there's lots of requests on communities. You have to be respectful that now might not be the right time. Anything I've missed? Yeah, those were our main reflections.
Thank you. Yeah, I see some folks have to jump off for 2 p.m. and that's totally understandable. If folks can and do want to stay, we can continue to have some more discussion. Were there other report backs? If not, we can open up to general questions if anyone has them, and comments. Very happy to engage in a little bit of further discussion. Again, if people can stay and want to, that's fine. Julian.
Hi. So you touched on the point that Indigenous peoples are not one monolith. They're just not one monolith. And so when we think about how to incorporate Indigenous peoples into, say, a research project, so that's what I'm thinking of, right? I mean, we can acknowledge that and acknowledge that as a limitation, but I guess how do we deal with that? It seems like, well, okay, so we have an Indigenous person, but that's just representing one group. Yeah, I just wonder how to interpret that and without erroneously trying to extrapolate representation.
Yeah, it's a really good point, right? Of course, you don't want, I'm one Métis person, right? Like, so I don't speak on behalf of an entire community, or even my experience of being Métis in the world could be very different than another person's experience of being a Métis person in the world. So yeah, you don't want to extrapolate from one person, but I think that that's true across research when we do it of all peoples, right? Like, we don't expect anyone to stand in as the representative voice for all people. So it's simply moving beyond the idea that one representative voice, as you've pointed out, or even just a couple representative voices, are enough to create a sort of static line in the research, right? That is the research that we've gathered, or that is the perspective of those peoples. And I think that's often what happens, right? When we talk about doing research with Indigenous peoples, is that you go in, you have consultation with maybe one person or something like that. And that it comes to stand for the perspective of an entire group, as opposed to acknowledging the limitations of that singular voice or those few voices in a way that would be representative in all good research, right? So, and I think that it's also thinking about from the beginning of the research project, and this came up, I think it was Rosie's group, Alex, you were there, that that from the beginning of a research project, thinking through, well, how do we actually bring in more representative voices for Indigenous consultation right from the get-go? So designing your research project from the beginning with Indigenous perspectives in mind, and then from there, if we're applying IGBA plus perspective, then saying, and are these even diverse perspectives? Like, are we just going to Indigenous leadership? Are we just going to this one Indigenous organization to get a perspective, or are we really diversifying where we're going to go in terms of doing our consent-based research, right? So I hope that answers your question, but those are my thoughts as a immediate response. Carrie, nice to see you.
Hi, Patricia. Nice to see you as well. It's been a while. It's great. I realize our group, we lost everyone, had to leave at 2, but I wanted to provide just a really brief sort of rundown on what we spoke about. We had like a minute left, but on the 7 guiding principles, one of the things we spoke about or discussed is centering Indigenous women's voices and Two-Spirit lived experience. I think one of the biggest and most important things to remember is if you want to do something like that, that as a non-Indigenous people, it's understanding sort of your role and your privilege and your bias and your beliefs, and sort of not taking up all that time and space, and that allowing for the space to become someone else's, not yours, and sort of that inward gazing. So I think that's really something really important when you are trying to center someone else's experience, is taking that step back. So we discussed that. And then sort of the longevity around relationship building, and that it's not just a meeting with the minister or a one-off. This is like a long-term, like long game thing that you need to put in the time and effort. And then as well, early education around especially boys and their privilege, and understanding that from a really young age. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you. Really appreciate that. And were you in the same group as Julia?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Report back in the chat, and I just wanted to make sure that we hadn't missed it in terms of the video, right? So maybe I'll just read that in as well, because I want to make sure that it's heard too. So decision-making and priority-setting considerations were discussed. Translating the IGBA Plus toolkit into a referenceable framework to support each other's commitments and sustaining meaningful engagements were spoken of. So just to include that too. Other questions or comments from the room or online? No. Oh.
Mic's on. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Shireen. You can hear me from somewhere, I think, right? You can hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. I just remembered something we had talked about here in the breakout room too, was knowing that most of the people here in the virtual room too are in the research field, is something that the council talks about, Patricia, is before engaging with Indigenous communities and women, is kind of looking at those key things that already exist out there. So of course, we know that you're research experts, but what already exists out there? So for example, the In Plain Sight report, have you actually gone through that report? Like, have you gone through that report word, like page by page? Because there is existing information. So doing that ahead of time before kind of connecting with communities, I think is important. And I think something that came up in my mind while I was just sitting here reflecting too on our conversation around, working with Indigenous communities is keeping in mind that I think for them, I can't speak for all of them, but for the most part, that they do want to work with you. They do want to work, I think, in unity with you on your specific project. But we have to keep in mind that for hundreds of years, there hasn't been that relationship, right? And there has been, you know, unsafe testing or unsafe research, right? So we have to remember that communities are coming from that place of that mistrust. So it will just take that time for that trust to build.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Yeah, that's a very good point. And yeah, it's, you know, I think about this all the time when people get in touch with me about, I mean, you know, there's when we work with McHugh as well, but also in my own work, right? When people get a hold of me and they're like, oh, wow, I've got this really great thing that I want to go do with this Indigenous community. What do you think? And I often say, well, but have you read the 4 other reports about that, right? They're already out there. So, you know, maybe this community doesn't want to be bothered again about the same thing. And or what can you learn from those before you think about going to a community with, you know, with your own agenda, your own research agenda, right? Because that's a really extractivist kind of approach anyway, to think of it that way. And I just want to acknowledge Shane's question in the chat here too. So one thing I struggle with in my work is how to include Indigenous people in research studies that are not Indigenous specific. And then says decentralized trial frameworks could be one way to break down those barriers to participation. Absolutely. And I think, Shane, I mean, I don't know exactly what your research is about, so you could always contextualize this a bit. But something that I think is important to think about when you're trying to engage Indigenous peoples in work that might not be Indigenous specific is what is the theme or the research goal that is going to have an impact on Indigenous people's lives, right? So I think that thinking about it from instead of from the research question, thinking about it from the research result side can sometimes really affect that engagement instead. Because if the research result is something that is going to have a net positive or is going to be able to allow you to have insight into some ways that medical or a health issue plays out in Indigenous people's lives, then thinking about the result and how, and if it's different potentially because of access to healthcare, because of access to you know, doctors or resources, or even access to the study, is going to affect Indigenous people's lives. And that can be in erasure, right? Like if they don't have access to this, then the negative effects that they're having now will continue. So kind of starting at the other side of it sometimes helps to think through then how to draw in participation or how to draw in partners that might be able to help you engage with Indigenous communities or people in the work that you're doing. So again, that's without having a lot of context for your work, but
Yeah, thanks for that, Patricia. I my current role, I work with a lot of different research teams, so this is a very broad question. Um, but at least like previously, at one point, I worked directly in kidney transplant research, for instance, and I know in that research, we encountered a lot of people who were interested in being part of different research studies, but they had transportation issues or they had other barriers like that because they were often in like rural areas, smaller communities far away from, you know, the Vancouver mainland. Um, so yeah, like I think that's something that is always a challenge, right? Is like how do we get accurate representation from groups that are not necessarily living close to our research centers?
yeah, absolutely. Um, and of course, funding is always an issue when you're dealing with that kind of thing, right? So, I mean, I found in the legal context, in terms of um, clinical legal work where I had students representing Indigenous clients, one of the things I ended up having to do was go to private donors to get money to send students to remote communities, right? So I couldn't I couldn't really just like, I mean, well, I could justify it just fine, but the big funders often didn't see the justification for sort of like, you've got this huge amount of money and it's going to help this few people in this way, and we have to do all of this work to make it happen. Whereas the private donors I was able to approach were often much more open to a conversation about how that would have a long-term positive impact on a community over time, right? And that kind of approach and thinking is sort of grounded in the perspectives here, right? In the toolkit, is that it's like, what is the real impact of colonization over time here? And then how can we undo that through applying the principles in terms of thinking about the work that we want to do with communities, and unveiling, right, the way that we can decolonize the research in order to have a positive effect over time in a community. And it often involves longer term projects and more investment on our end, right? As opposed to just sort of like coming in, asking a bunch of Indigenous, women questions about things, and then being like, "Thanks for that, bye." So yeah, it's a different approach, but yeah, it definitely needs to be done, I think. So thank you for the question. Okay. Well, it is 2:15. I've kept you 15 minutes past our end time already. But I really want to thank everybody so much for this amazing opportunity to present on the IGBA Plus Toolkit. Thank you so much to Nicole and everyone on your team for making this possible. Thank you to Shireen for doing all the work on our end as the McHugh Secretariat to make it happen too. And just really appreciate the engagement everyone brought to the session today. And again, thank you so much for allowing me to present virtually instead of in person, which I much would have preferred. And hopefully there's a chance to come back in the future and engage again in person. Thank you so much. Yay.